Welcome to Fish University, your one-stop shop for the science behind fish management. It is part of the Natural Resources University Podcast Network. I'm Wes Neal, your host. I'm an extension professor of fisheries and a researcher for Mississippi State University. Join me as I talk to researchers, managers, and landowners about the tools and science and the tricks of the trade for managing fish, water, and habitat. The goal is for you to have better fishing and a healthier aquatic ecosystem. So grab a notebook and the beverage of your choice and relax and enjoy Fish University. Welcome to Fish University. Now, we all love fish for one reason or another. Maybe you keep species in aquaria, or maybe you're an avid pond owner and a manager of fish. Maybe you're a trophy bass angler, or perhaps you're into scuba diving. Maybe you're all of these things. Whatever drives your love and pursuit of fish, I know you will agree that the more you know about fish and about how fish work, the more effective you're going to be in your fish passion. So with that in mind, today we're going to talk about how fish work. And my guest is Dr. Peter Allen. Peter is a professor of aquatic sciences at Mississippi State University. He is an expert in fish physiology, and he and I have collaborated on a number of research projects for more than a decade, and is one of the smartest people I know when it comes to how fish work. So, Peter, how are you doing today?
Thanks, Wes. I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on this. And after an introduction like that, I'm afraid for what I'll say next.
Well, just say whatever you want. I'm sure the people want to hear it. So, Peter, tell us a little bit. I like to have my guests, before we get into the subject matter, to tell us a little bit about where you come from and what got you into fish in general and fish physiology specifically, and a little bit about what you do.
Sure. Thanks, Wes. So I grew up on the West Coast. I was born in Seattle, and I guess it's appropriate in a state where it rains all the time. My residential neighborhood behind my house, there was probably about 100-acre woods, but there's a trout stream back there. And as kids, with my friends and my brothers, we'd go back in the woods and we'd just play around, and we found out that we could go fishing back there. And so early on, I was kind of fascinated with fish and kind of the mystery of what fish are and how they work and this aquatic environment they're in. And as I got a little bit older, I'd go down to the Puget Sound, which was usually just a lift from my dad down to a floating pier. And I'd go out there with friends, and we'd spend our summers just fishing out on the pier and catch all kinds of interesting fish. But yeah, I was always fascinated by fish. And then when my family moved down to Southern California, and I got into bass fishing down there. A lot of reservoirs, not a lot of water, so all the fishers are concentrated on a few reservoirs there, but really good bass fishing, and for large bass, but not you won't catch a lot. You'll just catch a few large ones generally. And had a lot of fun there with my friends too, and from that point, I went to college, got my bachelor's at Santa Barbara, and studied biological sciences with an emphasis in aquatic biology, and actually worked in biotech for about 6 years and environmental consulting, and reached a point where maybe like a lot of viewers, where you're like, hey, I think I need a little bit of a change, and I want to go back to some of the things I enjoyed. And so I went back to grad school and got into fish. Didn't think of the kind of intersection of physiology and fish as a potential career, but then I met a guy named Joseph Check who showed me that, hey, this is a really interesting career, and fish are these machines that basically sense their environment and find a way to live. And so kind of got interested in fish and physiology from there, and really it's taken off from there. Lived in Canada, been down here in Mississippi, which is an amazing place, and of course on adventures with you in various spots around the world.
Great introduction to fish physiology and how you got into it. One of the things that I was thinking before we started this podcast was that fish physiology is such a broad topic that you teach whole classes on it. I mean, we could spend literally, the whole year recording podcasts on each topic we're going to try to briefly address today. So we're only going to scratch the surface. But I think you mentioned fish and their environment. The environment's probably the best place for us to start. Maybe we just start where they live, which is the water. And I read a real interesting quote not long ago that described fish as a fish is basically just a fluid-filled bag floating in another fluid with only a thin skin to separate the inside and out. So, when we think about that, we think about the water that the fish live in. Usually the water and the inside of the fish are two very different environments, right? Two very different concentrations, and stuff's always trying to change sides. Let's talk about fish and what we call osmoregulation.
Sure. And I think you're right. Like, we could go a lot of different directions with this topic, and let's just have fun with it and see where it takes us a little bit. But yeah, so osmoregulation, we're talking about water regulation, and also closely connected to that, we'd be talking about ion regulation, which is really just a fancy word for the regulation of salts. And because osmotically, water is going to follow those salts. And so if you're a fish in water and you're regulating at a different internal salt level as the water around you, then there's going to be certain challenges to that, whereby the salt inside you is going to try and leave your body just by diffusion. You're looking at salt movement from a high concentration to a low concentration. And on the other hand, if you're a fish in salt water, it's just the opposite. So you'd have, a much higher salt concentration outside of you, less inside of you. And so the salt's going to try and come in and the water's going to try and leave. So in either place, if you're thinking of a fish as a sack within a body of water, the salt inside and the water is going to try and balance out. And so that's really the first and main problem that fish has got to accomplish. If it can't do that, you're really looking at the reasons why a freshwater fish can't be in salt water, or a saltwater fish can't be in freshwater. And there's a lot that goes on to achieve that. But those are sort of the very basics.
Yeah, and you mentioned that a freshwater fish can't be in salt water, but on the other extreme is a freshwater fish can't be in pure water. And I oftentimes tell people that, and they give me this really curious look. And they're like, what do you mean? I always thought fish need clean water. Well, fish do need clean water, but they can't live in pure water. And if you've ever gone to a county fair and you've played some competition and you've won a goldfish, and you take that goldfish in a bag home and you plop it into a bowl, and then one day you say, well, I need to change the water. So you grab a gallon of distilled water and you change the water to 100% water change and put the goldfish is going to die. It may take it a day or two, but that's because there's zero salt in distilled water. So that fish is constantly trying to keep its salt from leaving and get the water that's going into it out of its body. And this causes a lot of stress. So if a fish is put into pure water, the salt in its body wants to leave. The water in the pure water wants to come into the fish's blood to equalize that concentration. And the fish has to work to remove water and to keep salt in its body. And because of that, those fish are expending a lot of energy and they're becoming very stressed out. And those of you who are listening and you are fish managers, you may remember that a lot of times farm ponds need to have lime applied to them, much like a garden. If your garden needs lime, your pond in the same pasture probably needs lime, because the lime, which is usually calcium carbonate or calcium magnesium carbonate, and when you add that to the water, the carbonate is essentially going to be a salt in the water to help a few different things happen. One is it prevents that water from being too close to being pure water, and the fish isn't stressed out. The environment external to the fish is closer to the environment inside the fish. The fish are not constantly working to try to equalize. And it does a lot of other things for nutrient availability and pH levels and buffering capacity too. But so when we talk about liming ponds, This comes back to this osmoregulation, among other things. Fish simply can't tolerate water that's a lot different from their internal environment. And you'd mentioned that, freshwater fish can't live in saltwater and saltwater fish can't live in freshwater, but we have some fish that move between the two environments. And what makes them special?
Yeah, that's a great question. And a lot of people, over time have really been fascinated by, well, how do fish go from either fresh to saltwater or salt to fresh? And along those lines, we've got examples of fish that do it at some point in their life. Maybe you're familiar with a fish in your own area. Maybe if you're in some place where you've got trout or salmon, and at a certain point in a salmon's life, it grows and then moves downstream and goes into salt water. But if you took that salmon at another point, say in the year, and then tried to move it out to salt water, it may not do it very successfully. And so the body actually does a lot of changes to prepare the fish for that in those types of fishes. The other group really that we could think about would be those fish that you might find where you have fresh water flows into salt water, something called an estuary. And in those areas, you've got the tides that move back and forth. And so if you're a fish in that environment, I guess you could either move up or down with the tide, or you're going to have to adjust rapidly as the salinity changes if you're staying in one spot. And there's a number of different strategies for that. Really, some of the things are similar between those two groups of fishes, say the salmon that move at certain times in their life, and those fish that really are able to move on a daily basis back and forth. And it comes down to a couple main structures of the fish that really do a lot of this. And one of those structures is, think about this like a strategy. So you've got a fish, and most of the outside of the fish is what we call the skin or the integument. And so if we're thinking about something that's leaky, they don't allow a lot of water or salt to move through the skin, most fish. And so that's one way that they can accomplish having an internal environment that's different than the external. And so if you have many layers of skin or cell thickness or scales that help create a distance between the water outside and the water inside, that's good. But you still need to do some things that are important in those environments, and that is things like breathe. And so you can't block out everything, because then you'd block out oxygen. You have to have some structure that allows your blood to interact with the water, and you can't have a very thick layer of skin in that area. For most fish, that would be the gills. And so the gills is a structure that has a very thin layer of cells, sometimes only one layer thick, that'll allow for gases to come in and out. And the challenge there is if a fish is doing that and it's allowing some gases to come in and out there, well, the salt is also going to come in there, or water's going to leave or come in as well. It's sort of like you can't have one without the other. And so then therein lies a bit of a challenge for the fish. And so do they change their gills in terms of to allow more gases, or do they have a better ability for salt regulation? And so if we're looking at some of those groups of fishes that, like a salmon that moves at certain points in their life, they will basically have a changeover in a lot of the types of the cells on those gills that switches the direction of salt pumping. And so if you're in freshwater, as you mentioned, Wes, that, hey, you've got a low external salt concentration and much higher internally. So you're always trying to pump salt from the outside and get it inside the body. Meanwhile, water's going to follow that salt. And so you've got to have some way to deal with that. And so as odd as it sounds, a fish in fresh water has to urinate a lot, because all this water is following the salt in that's pumping in to counteract for salt that's just passively leaving through the gills as a part of breathing. And the opposite is true in salt water. And really what you get down to with these fish that are able to be in an estuary and handle these salt changes back and forth is they're really good at changing the gills quickly. And so they almost have some fish almost have what looks like a cover. It'll go over some of these ion pumping cells to sort of seal them off for the time being and then pull that back when they need them. Each group of fish is a bit different too. And that's a big challenge and a big excitement for studying fish because, if we think about humans ourselves, sure, we do things a similar way, no matter where you are. Your body is physiologically similar to somebody who's a long distance away, etc. But if you're a fish, you've got over 25,000 species of fish, and they don't all do things the same way. They have some similar ways of doing it, but they may accomplish it very differently. And that's not just true for osmoregulation or salt regulation, but it's true for a lot of other things, including breathing as well.
So what I heard you say there was that when someone says you drink like a fish, they're talking about a saltwater fish. And if somebody says you pee like a fish, you're talking about a freshwater fish. Am I correct?
You are correct. Yeah. So if you're a fish in freshwater, yeah, you are urinating, but you almost never have to drink. A fish in saltwater, unlike the water everywhere and not a drop to drink, if you're a fish, you got to drink. So because the water is passively leaving your body, and so they have to drink in saltwater, which sounds crazy, but they have mechanisms to get rid of the salt and retain the water. So yeah, you are right.
You mentioned the gills, and we've been talking about this concentration difference between the outside of the fish and the inside of the fish. There's also a concentration difference in the oxygen level between the water and the blood of the fish. And if the two are always trying to equilibrate, then it seems to me that the fish can only take out about half of the amount of oxygen that's in the water under normal circumstances because it's just diffusing across the gill epithelia or the gill membranes. So fish have evolved some pretty cool ways to get around that concentration difference, right? We're talking about counter-current exchange. Let's talk about that a little bit.
Sure. Yeah. So you were right, Wes. It's a fish is going to be limited on how much oxygen that it can take from the water into the blood based on a diffusion gradient. And so the diffusion gradient is made up of basically the amount of oxygen in the water, which is due to the amount of oxygen, atmospheric oxygen, that makes up our atmosphere. And then it's how well is the water equilibrated with the atmosphere in terms of that diffusion of oxygen into it. And so there's these different layers if you're thinking about it. How do we get oxygen from the atmosphere into the water? How do we get oxygen in the water into the blood of the fish? And so those are some of the main challenges. And let's just say you have oxygen at a certain pressure that's in the water. And so the pressure of that oxygen in the blood has to be lower than in the water for it to then diffuse inside the fish. And the way fish do that is they have a structure in their gill, and it's this flat, sort of looks like a half pancake, and they're all stacked at regular intervals on their gill surfaces, and we call those gill lamellae. So it looks like a bunch of very thin pancakes. Why have this thin pancake structure? Well, it gives a lot of surface area, and so that it's not very thick. Remember, I mentioned that the cell layer in the gills is very thin, and it's thinnest in the lamella because this is where gas exchange occurs. So these little pancake structures have blood pumping in one direction, and it's the opposite direction of flow of water that the fish is taking in through its mouth and putting out through across these gills and then back out the other side. So by pumping blood in the opposite direction as water's moving, as that oxygen diffuses into the blood, there's always a concentration difference. Even though the oxygen is being depleted in the water as it moves through the gills and across these structures, and the oxygen's increasing in the blood as it moves in the opposite direction, there's always this difference from outside to in that allows the fish to maximize this diffusional mechanism, for lack of a better word, to get that oxygen inside the body.
And the other issue, you mentioned that there's several layers of where the oxygen comes from. And the first layer is, how does the oxygen get into the water? Oxygen pretty much can only diffuse at the surface layer of the water. The rest is being produced within the water via like phytoplankton that are within the water. But sometimes oxygen levels in the water go pretty low. I mean, in fact, in the atmosphere, we're lucky. We always have, 23% oxygen, something like that in the air. And that's pretty standard unless you close yourself in a room or a closet or something. You always have you always have the same amount of oxygen available to you because we're in a very large reservoir of air, and all the processes that refresh it, they're going on globally. The water's not the same way. In the water, the oxygen levels can go up and down, and in fact, they do go up and down all the time. On a diel basis, it's quite striking where during the peak of the day, when we have lots of photosynthesis, oxygen levels can hit their peak, but they can only go so high because only so much can dissolve within the water at specific water temperatures. And then at night, when photosynthesis is no longer going on, but everything is using up oxygen, or respiration's occurring, and that's not just the fish, that's the plants too, that's the microbes and the biological activity of breaking down decaying materials. Oxygen levels drop off at night because everything uses oxygen. So in a typical farm pond, for example, during the middle of summer, it's not uncommon to see oxygen levels hit 8 or 10 milligrams per liter in the heat of the day and get down to 1 or 2 milligrams per liter and 5 o'clock in the morning. Fish have to deal with that, and it's not easy for them to deal with it, and they're not always successful. I deal with a lot of fish kills during the summer. So what are some ways that fish can regulate either their behavior, their body function, or activity levels to try to deal with low oxygen situations?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, Wes, and I think we could jump off into a lot of different directions with that. But just to try and take it from a general perspective first, I think that you've got behaviorally, if you're looking at what can a fish do and what does it do, I think a lot of listeners may be familiar with seeing fish kind of up near the surface. And so, most fish don't breathe air. So a listener may be thinking, well, then why do they come to the surface if they don't breathe air? Well, as you just mentioned, the diffusion of oxygen from the atmosphere in the water is going to be best right at that surface layer of water. And the deeper you go, the chances are that diffusion could be more limited. Now, if you have a water body that has a lot of mixing between the top and the bottom, well, you're not going to get much layers, or what we may call stratification of oxygen in there, so to speak. But if a fish is able to come up to the surface and breathe in that sort of water-air interface area, it's going to get the water that has the highest amount of oxygen in it. So that is definitely one strategy. And then there's just thinking about fishes, and as a listener could think about, they're probably familiar with some of the different fishes where they live. Let's just say, you've got maybe a river nearby, and if you're in an area where the river's shallow and it's a rocky bottom, there's probably a lot of mixing between the air and the water because of all that turbulence. And compare that with, let's say, a fish that's from an area that is kind of a backwater area, or let's just say a sluggish body of water that doesn't have a lot of mixing, and maybe it's a warm environment on top of that. Some of the habitats we've got down here in the south. And so fish in those two different environments, they've been in those areas for a long time. And so some of their, what we call adaptation, some of their ability to handle those environments are sort of fine-tuned for those places. And they're fine as long as they're in those types of places. But when we create a different type of environment for them, their flexibility to that new change We may see it in a number of ways. One of, as you mentioned, is the inability to handle a change in oxygen. It's lower than what they're used to. And in aquaculture, we see it a lot, of course, even though we've got fish like channel catfish that are very hardy fish that can handle low oxygen. They still have their limits. But if you're let's say where you're fishing for salmon or trout, and they're from a flowing environment with high oxygen, and you put them in an environment that has a lower oxygen, or you just put a high density of fish there, or it could be during a spawning migration or a grouping of fish where they deplete the oxygen just due to density. There's some challenges there in terms of you're going to knock that oxygen lower. And those are some of the times we see fish kills, as you're mentioning. It could be, there was a big fish kill on a western river when I was a graduate student out west, and it happened because water temperatures got up. All the salmon were moving in, and they were kind of stacked in big pools waiting for the next stage, and there was a drought at the same time. And so it was just like a pond for catfish in the south, in that you had a high density fish, not a lot of turnover of water, so it depleted the oxygen layer. So in both places, you can definitely find that fish have limits. And of course, well, why do they have these limits? And one of the things is that their blood has, in their red blood cells actually take the oxygen that diffuses in. They basically capture that. And you can kind of think about almost like little cars driving down the street. You've got these red blood cells where the oxygen hops in the passenger seat or the back seat, and then it drives it to the muscle or whatever tissue that needs that oxygen. And they open the doors and let the oxygen out, and it diffuses into the tissue, etc. Well, those red blood cells or those cars that are driving around are different in different fish. And so some of those cars are really good at picking up passengers, but they're not as good as dropping the passengers off. And other cars are not as good at picking up the passengers, but they're pretty good at dropping them off as long as things are in the oxygen range where they normally are. And so that's really what we're getting at. And what we're really talking about there is hemoglobin, which is inside those red blood cells. That's really kind of the heart of the car that's getting it back and forth. And some fish, like our catfish, their hemoglobin is really good at grabbing onto oxygen, and that's why they do so well in some of these lower oxygen environments. In contrast, some of these fish, like a trout or a salmon, well, the hemoglobin in those fish is a bit different, and it does better when the oxygen is higher, but it's also able to offload oxygen pretty well, whereas a catfish, it can still offload the oxygen, but not at the same efficiency that, let's say, a trout or salmon would in a high oxygen environment, because in a catfish, the blood is so good at grabbing onto oxygen, but it may not let it go as easily unless there's a big change internally in pH, something like that.
And you mentioned, trout and salmon living in high oxygen environments. It's not just because they're in flowing rivers, although that helps. Water temperature plays a big role in that, and trout tend to be cold water species. More oxygen can dissolve into water at lower temperature. The saturation point of oxygen for, say, a salmon might be 30 or 40% higher than the saturation point for, say, a channel catfish, just from water temperature alone. And then the fact that one's living in a flowing environment where you have rapids and churning of air bubbles into the water to help diffusion, whereas the other lives in a fairly stable, non-moving pond or lake where it tends to get thermal stratification and then only diffusion comes from the surface. But the other species I was thinking about are some of the species that have come up with ways to actually breathe the air. You mentioned that a little bit ago, that most fish can't breathe air, but there are some that can. Here in the South, one I think of a lot is our gar. Gar seem to do very well in some of the most stagnant backwater areas with extremely high water temperatures that the average fish just couldn't survive in. So how does a fish breathe air?
Different fish have different structures to breathe air. And this is, again, I mentioned earlier that there are over 25,000 species of fish. And there's a high number of fish species that actually have the ability to breathe air, but they don't all do it the same way. Gar are kind of interesting because they have an opening from the gut and it goes into what's called their gas bladder or their swim bladder, it's called sometimes too. It's that opening to the gut is controlled by muscles that ring around it. And we could think of it like a sphincter or almost like a pneumatic duct that opens and closes under certain circumstances, not all the time. It's usually closed. And so those fish that breathe air, they will take that air in and they will hold it. And so for a gar, they have this gas bladder. And how do they get the air in the body? Well, they've got a lot of blood vessels that are around that structure. In a sense, it's like a primitive lung. And, do fish have lungs? We've got lungfish out there. Well, not necessarily. They have a structure they use to breathe air. And we call that the air-breathing organ, regardless of what type of fish it is. But some folks also may be familiar with like a fish in their home aquarium where they've got like these little South American catfishes they call cories. They'll kind of go up to the surface, grab a breath of air, come back down, and they actually breathe air through their intestines. So, a very different location. But regardless for fish, if they're breathing air through a structure such as the gar, that's this swim bladder that they also use for buoyancy, or if it's a fish like the cory that's breathing through their intestine, you have a commonality, and that is the tissue is very thin and it's highly vascularized, just meaning that there's a lot of blood vessels around that to extract that oxygen out of it. What's really kind of interesting, Wes, is that when we breathe in oxygen, we breathe out carbon dioxide. For the most part, fish will take in that air and they'll extract the oxygen, but they won't put very much carbon dioxide in it. And so, in a sense, their out-breath is just sort of a air that's depleted of oxygen. But the carbon dioxide level hasn't necessarily changed that much. And so where they're getting rid of the carbon dioxide is actually generally through the gills. And so this is really kind of an interesting disconnect between, when we think about how we breathe and how a fish that breathes air breathes. And there's challenges for fish, and maybe I'm getting on a tangent here a little bit, but when they hold that carbon dioxide in the body, what it does is it drops the pH of the fish, because carbon dioxide and water is in an equilibrium with bicarbonate and acid ions, or a proton, which is just a positive hydrogen ion, and that's where we get pH. So, the more of these acid or proton ions we have, the lower pH we have. And so when CO2 is moving through the blood, it's not in the gaseous form normally, it's in the form of bicarbonate and this proton or acid ion. And so as a result, because air-breathing fish hold on to CO2 and get rid of it at the gills, their pH drops, and that has a number of different changes and challenges for them as well. But importantly, they can survive in these low-oxygen habitats, and this is an amazing adaptation these fish have. One thing I was thinking about too is that low-oxygen water, regardless of where fish are around the globe, seems to be the main driver for air breathing in fish. And we were talking about farm ponds and fish that breathe, air. Well, obviously not farm ponds. Catfish, at least our U.S. catfish, are from the family Ictaluridae. They can't breathe air. Now, there are families of catfish in other regions of the world that can breathe air, and that can be a good thing for people trying to find food and raise food in those areas that don't have access to electricity. Well, then this is a good thing. You can raise a fish there for local consumption that you don't have to have aeration, water mixing with air, etc. But I was also thinking about for folks that are on the coast, and you've got tide pools. And so tide pools are really kind of an interesting area. And for folks in the South, you can just think of them like a small pond. So they're these little tiny ponds, but the fish relative to the size of the pond are much, much bigger. And so when the tide recedes and it's at nighttime, we have the same challenges we have in a pond here in the South, and that is oxygen depletes rapidly. And so these are some of the areas we tend to find other air-breathing fishes that we have, especially along the coast. There are these small fishes that can actually come up to the surface and sometimes even climb out of the tide pool and go to another tide pool to find a better spot. So, yeah, fish are fascinating. I get excited about them.
So, Peter, let's move on to senses. With humans usually say we have 5 senses. I know there's some that argue we actually have more than that. Fishes have quite a few unique senses. Let's talk about how many senses the average fish has and some of the more unique ones that you've seen in your work and in the literature.
Yeah, senses in fish, very interesting. And so, there's a lot of ways that when we think about fish that they're different than how we relate to the world. Some ways we can obviously kind of see ourselves in a sense in a fish's body. When we go swimming, we think, well, if I'm moving through the water, I sure get tired quickly. And so how does a fish do that? And that's another episode we could talk about at some point in the future. But yeah, in terms of senses, fish have some different senses and some similar senses. And going back to how we started this whole conversation off, a lot of it has to do with how water either limits or facilitates some of these senses too. And so if you're thinking about water, anybody who's been swimming or moving through the water or driving their boat, hey, they know that water has a much higher density than what is in air. And so there are some good things for the sensory system that then facilitate that. The other thing we were talking about is salts in the water and how fish have to regulate water. You said osmoregulation and salt, ion regulation. But those salts also allow for some different sensory systems than we have ourselves as well. Can fish see? Yes, fish have eyes, they can see. Are their eyes the same as us? No. We can get into that in a minute, perhaps. Do fish hear? Yes, fish can hear. They have a hearing system. The inner ear is both for auditory hearing and hearing in the sense of waves in the water. Think of sound as a wave, either low frequency all the way to high frequency that's moving through the water. So if you're driving your boat through the water, this is another thing. What type of frequencies are you putting out? Can a fish perceive that? Yes, and it depends on the fish. Different species have acute hearing for different vibration frequencies. But because water is so dense, sound moves very well through water and even faster through water than in air. And so because fish are in water, sound waves actually move through their body too. And so this is one way that some fish can hear extremely well because of those properties of water. And in a sense, their body's transmitting that sound wave as it moves through it as well. So, so we can talk about hearing. Hearing is very interesting as well. Taste. Can fish taste their environment? You betcha. And they're not necessarily limited to their mouth, which sounds crazy too. A lot of fish have taste buds over different parts of their body, and not just like we think about maybe a fish that's got barbels or projections around their head, and they've actually got cells that are able to sense different chemicals in the water, and chemicals relate to taste. So we're also tasting different chemicals when we're eating foods and relating that to, hey, that food tastes like this or that food tastes like that. Fish also can smell, and this is also from chemicals in the water. As the water's moving over the fish, they have openings in their head called nares, which are sort of analogous to our nose. And so water can move usually by one direction. It'll move in one way and out another way. And they have a system called the olfactory system that's able to bind on to some of those different chemicals as it's moving across. And then that's how they can smell. It takes a signal to the brain that says that, it could be either that this smells bad, this smells good, or, this is kind of the chemical cues I'm looking for. And that relates to other types of things like migrations in fish as well. And then fish can actually sense, they can touch. They can both touch in sort of the near field when something bumps into them, but they also have this lateral line system that is basically these sort of along both sides of the fish in general, but also around different parts of the head as well, that they can sense different vibrations in the water. And this is related a little bit to the inner ear and hearing as well, in terms of some of the cell types that are in there that basically flex when water movements change, and that flexion causes a signal to the brain that says, hey, something just moved over on your right side about halfway back there. And so fish are kind of unique in that they can do that compared to us. Like, we don't really understand quite how that works when we think about our own head and try and put ourselves in a fish's body, because we don't have that sense. And the other would be electroreception or electrogeneration. And so this is really different. I think you're getting at like the movie The Sixth Sense or something like that initially. But yeah, when we're thinking about electroreception and electrogeneration, this is the ability to sense an electric field around the body, or, which is even crazier, create an electric field, or even crazier than that, create an electric charge and use that as a tool. So yeah, it's pretty amazing. And can all fish do all these senses? No. Can all fish make sense their electrical environment? No. Can all fish generate an electric charge? No. But some fish can. Again, coming back to why fish are so interesting, it's, well, why does this fish have this ability? How does it use it? Why doesn't this fish? And you could think of even something like vision. Some folks may be familiar with some fish that don't have eyes, like we've got these cave fish or some of these fish. Well, okay, if we remove one sense, how then do they sense their world around them? So, yeah, fish are fascinating.
You said that, they have a few senses that we don't have. One that came to mind was the sense of distant touch, the ability to sense vibrations in the water, and not only to know that there's a vibration in the water, but more or less be able to detect where it's at. This is pretty important if you're an angler. I mean, if you've ever thrown a crankbait, a lipped crankbait that doesn't have a rattle in it, it has a sound, but just has a vibration, those fish feel that. They know where it's at. They can sense where it's at, and they can come find it. So it plays a role in how we fish. It plays a role in how fish behave and how they work. It can even play a role in how we manage fish sometimes. For example, we're trying to deal with species that are invasive. We can use things like their sense of sight, flashing lights, their sense of hearing, their sense of vibration, their electrical senses to make barriers to try to prevent these fish from moving. The big-headed carps, the silver carp and big-headed carps of the Mississippi River, millions of dollars are being spent on trying to keep those fishes out of the Great Lakes using barriers that are electrical, bubble barriers, sound barriers, so we can utilize their senses against them in a lot of ways. But the other one I thought was really interesting is the idea of generating an electrical charge. The one that always gets me is, of course, the electric eel. I mean, the amount of charge that animal can generate and release suddenly, I don't know if it can kill a human, but it can certainly knock a human out.
It's got 600 volts.
Yeah, 600 volts generated from an animal's body. How does it do it?
Yeah, and I think another question would be, why don't they get shocked too?
Yes.
And so the fish have modified muscle cells, and in the electric eel, they have a large percentage of their body are these modified muscle cells. And every time that, in terms of a muscle cell goes through basically a contraction or a depolarization where you've got a change that's stimulated by a nerve impulse, and that nerve impulse changes the depolarization. So suddenly it's allowing different ions to rush into the cell, and that creates a charge difference across that cell. Most of those cells, it's probably like about 150 millivolts, something like that. Well, these muscle cells are basically oriented, sort of stacked on top of each other. And so as those signals are moving to it, it's basically moving in a wave down that fish. And so for electric eel, it's moving from sort of towards the back, towards the head. And so when it comes out into its environment around it, it'll stun something that's by the mouth that then is incapacitated for a period of time, and an electric eel can go and grab that. Well, why isn't the eel shocked at the same time? Well, some of it is the placement of lipids in the body in terms of having that skin layer we talked about earlier for osmoregulation. And so it's sort of having some lipids in that layer is also a bit of an electrical separation from outside. And also the generation, the direction of the charge moving from in to out helps the eel as well. But apparently the eels may get shocked a little bit in the process, because when they actually generate this electric voltage charge that comes out, they also have a twitch behaviorally when it comes out as well. So is it free? No, it costs a lot of energy for those muscles all to be stacked up like that to allow that charge to move out of it. So that is another reason why not all fishes have that. Well, it costs a lot of energy. And so if you're doing that, you're probably in some environment that it needs to be there. And so, maybe it's in a turbid environment, such as where the electric eel is, that, it's sensing a fish around it. So it has both electroreception. So it's in a sense, looking electrically to see what's breaking up the electric field around it. Is that object a conductor, or is it not a conductor? If it's a conductor, then it's probably something biologic. And then based on previous experience in terms of signaling feedback with the brain, that could be food, that may not be food. And so it could be a plant, obviously, or something like that too.
And you were talking about, does the eel get shocked? Why doesn't the eel get shocked? With electrofishing, some species of fish are extremely susceptible, and some species of fish, like cichlids, peacock bass, and tilapia, are relatively less susceptible to electrical currents in the water, and it's not entirely clear why. For me, it's not entirely clear why. I'm sure some smart person somewhere knows, but I've never fully understood why a peacock bass, which doesn't look that different from a largemouth bass, is a whole lot more tolerant of an electrical field than a largemouth bass. But I want to stick with senses real quick. One more question. This actually came from one of our listeners who wanted to ask, and you've talked a little bit about color and you've talked a bit about sense, and the listener wanted to know, do bass actually like certain color baits? Can they see the color? And do the scents that we use in fishing actually make a difference?
Yeah, no, it's an interesting question, and I think I like that a listener sent that in, because I think there's probably a lot of listeners that have the same type of question, and I've heard it asked for other types of fishes too. Hey, what color bait should I be fishing with out there? We could talk a long time about vision and what's different for fish, water versus air. And so the eye itself, is made of certain components. We think about, there's a lens, and of course you've got the iris, and then the eye itself is basically a fluid-filled sac as well. And so I always think of Shrek. If you remember the movie Shrek, where he squeezed the eyeball until the jelly came out, and that was always a good visual for me. But so the eye is, if we're thinking about how an image is going in and how focus is happening with that lens, unlike us, a fish cannot bend that lens. It's got a spherical lens, and part of the reason that the focus is very different from us and the fish is that we're able to really focus at sort of the fluid air interface with our eye, because our eye is basically aqueous, but we're seen in a gas-filled environment. Fish, it's trickier because the refractive index is a bit different there, because the eye itself is jelly-filled, but it's also water outside too. And so they help focus by having a spherical lens, being that the refractive index through the middle of the lens is different than on the outside edges of the lens as well. And what's even interesting is that a number of fish can kind of push that lens forward or retract it a bit too. That can actually help them see around the body too in terms of peripheral vision as well. So take that in for just a second, and then how does, we've got the lens focusing light back on the retina, and what's the retina? And so when we get down to how they're perceiving color and light, we have two structures in there. We have rods and we have cones. And so rods are really looking at light sensitivity. How bright is something, shades and contrast of color. And a lot of fish have a lot of rods and not as many cones. Some fish have more cones than others. Cones are the part they use for color vision. And so I think the first thing to say is, can fish see color? Well, a lot of fish can. When we think of ourselves or mammals, you're looking at red, green, and blue cones. So we're discerning different wavelengths of light. Light is, you're moving from sort of high frequency to low frequency wavelengths of light that are corresponding to those different colors. The other challenge is in an aqueous environment, light gets attenuated or absorbed with depth. And this is really interesting, and I'll ask my fish physiology class this too. I'll show them a picture of a red deep sea fish and a black deep sea fish and say, which has better color camouflage for deep water? And usually they'll point to the fish that's black and say, that one does. And the answer is neither is better, because there's red light's not penetrating very deep into the water, and so it doesn't matter if you're red or black at those deep depths, because you're not going to be seen. But in the shallow waters where most people are fishing, unless it's highly turbid, the red wavelengths can't get down to it, especially freshwater environments. Again, as long as it's not a highly turbid environment. So can the fish see, in terms of the color? I'm trying to remember exactly the question, Wes, but yeah, and I did some digging on this, just very shallow for largemouth bass, but there's been a few recent studies that have shown, hey, bass have red and green cones, and yes, they are able to distinguish a variety of colors. So I think the question is, can fish distinguish between colors? Yes, and so that would be based on the cones that are in the retina of the eyes. And can all fish see the same, have the same ability to see colors? No, that would be, some fish are definitely better adapted to see colors than other fish. It's probably going to relate back to their ecology, what type of environment are they in. Another example for ictulurid catfish, which are the type of catfish we've got here in the U.S., they have red and green cones, but not blue cones, as far as some of the studies have shown. Now, this is looking at, one species. Obviously, when we look at a different species, there's chances for different things. And that would relate to it. Some color is going to be limited in different groups of fish, depending on what they have. It's going to relate back to its ability to transmit light. Is it reflecting light? So the rods pick that up. So for a lighter color versus a darker color, and then is it in the color range or spectrum that they can actually pick up with the cones they have too? And then on top of that, how is turbidity affecting that as well? Is allowing enough light to come down that they can actually distinguish some of that as well. In my recollection, red light will get down to somewhere around 50 meters, something like that. The deeper you go, probably the ability to discern an actual red lure is going to be reduced.
And of course, we've already said fish have a lot more senses than the sense of sight. So you're using a red crankbait in deep water, they can still detect that crankbait through the sense of distant touch, vibrations in the water. So it's not that it becomes completely invisible. It's just that it's no longer red, essentially, or it becomes washed out color-wise.
Yeah, I think that's a very important thing to think about. Another thing that we could talk about sometime too is just learning in fishes, and why does one lure work for a little bit and then stop working? It's sort of the opposite of why will a fish eat a certain food that will feed them, something like that. It's like, well, at first, do they recognize it as food? And then do they get a positive feedback when they get said type of food? And for, say, a lure, if a lure is at first recognized as food, but there's a negative feedback associated with that, hey, this caused stress, and then some novel thing happened, it was lifted out of the water, maybe why they're not biting that the next time.
Yeah, I guess the other question that the listener asked was about smell and taste, and I guess that's getting to fish scent. You spray aniseed smell onto your lure or shad oil onto your lure. Does that make a big difference, do you think?
I think it could. A scent could do a couple things. One is it could taste like a food that the type of fish you're fishing for is used to eating. And so if that's the case, maybe it's got some type of amino acid complement or something that's reflective of said diet type, then yeah, they may encounter it and are close enough, and even, again, taste olfaction, they can smell from a distance away too. So that could be an attractant. On the other hand, putting some type of a scent on it could also mask an odor that is deterrent. So let's say that there's something that doesn't have a food response, or maybe there's even an association from the past of a scent that is associated with an avoidance behavior. For example, like salmon can scent some of the amino acids in some of the grizzly bear fur, and it's a deterrent. So could the same thing be happening in a place where you've got fish that have been caught a number of times and have a negative association for avoidance with a certain smell? Sure, in that sense, perhaps that could happen. I don't know if it has, but I could at least surmise that that's a possibility.
Okay, last question on scent. How do salmon find their way home to their natal streams?
Boy, that's a big question. So, I think within the river environment, they are basically tracking chemical cues in the water that are released by the substrate in a river environment. And so the river environment changes chemically from upstream to downstream, depending on the surface, bedrock, and the soils, etc., in that river environment. So they're tracking chemical cues as they go up the river through their olfactory system. Again, this is similar to our nose, that those chemicals go in, they bind, they send a signal to the brain that's telling them about that. And so there's a lot of complexities in terms of different types of receptors that bind different types of chemical cues and odors. And there's also the complexity of the brain and basically memory and stored, in a sense, a stored map of chemical makeup. And so what we do know is that for species that have been studied a lot, like a salmon, in their environment where the eggs are laid and fertilized and they start to grow, we have links to hormones or the endocrine system, particularly thyroid hormones, that will stimulate the olfactory system to basically record some of these, in a sense, smells as the fish is moving downstream. And those thyroid hormones, interestingly enough, are also for those downstream moving salmonids. They're often released at those peak events due to things like moon cycle and other types of environmental things where the fish would classically migrate downstream to suddenly turn up in terms of their acuity to sense those smells and record those as well. And then when the fish is an adult and it's moving back upriver, it's almost like looking at that map in reverse to try and get where they are. Is it perfect? No. And that's why we also have a number of fish that will stray from their original location. And sometimes that's actually important for fish actually occupying new habitats, etc. But yeah, that's a really good question, and we could talk a lot about that.
I think I want to end this podcast on a different fish migration story, what I think is probably the coolest migration of any fish species. Not the coolest of any animal. I think the monarch butterfly holds that record, but the American eel is probably the neatest fish in terms of its life history strategy. An American eel may be living in some of the headwaters of the Mississippi River in Minnesota, and it reaches its point in time when it says, oh, it's time for me to reproduce. It proceeds to swim down that tributary to a larger river, eventually into the Mississippi River. Down the Mississippi River, navigating locks and dams, gets finally out to the Gulf of Mexico, swims its way through the Gulf of Mexico, all the way around the tip of Florida into the Gulf Stream and out into the Atlantic Ocean, into what they call the Sargasso Sea, or a sea out there where a lot of sargassum seaweed is common. The American eel reproduces out there. We don't really know for sure what happens to the adults after they spawn. There's some indication that they're like salmon and it's a once and done event, but I've also heard people say that there's some indication they could return. I don't know. But what happens to the egg and the development of that egg is just phenomenal. This egg drifts around in the Atlantic Ocean for a while and finally hatches into something called a leptocephalus, which is essentially a transparent leaf-like larvae. Floats around as plankton in the ocean for a while. Eventually it floats its way into an estuary, and not necessarily the same estuary it came out of. And when it gets into the estuary, it transforms into, I guess next is a glass eel, is that correct?
Glass eel is first.
So then it transforms into a glass eel, and finally it looks a little bit like an eel, very small still transparent, and it goes from a glass eel, and then it will turn into an elver, which is basically a slightly larger glass eel with some color. I'm not sure if when it's an elver is when it begins to move into fresh waters. Eventually, at some point, becomes a yellow eel, which is an immature eel, which you can spend its life as a yellow eel. Maybe now it's in the James River in Virginia, and it goes up the James River, gets to the Cowpasture River, and somewhere up the Cowpasture River, it goes up some little headwater stream, and it will live there and make its life for the next 5, 10, 15 plus years, and eventually will transform into a silver eel, which is a mature eel, and do it all over again. And I just think that's the coolest story of any fish. You know, how does something so complex come about, and how has it been so successful for so long?
The eel is one of the great mysteries of really a lot of societies. You know, we've had everything from Sigmund Freud studied the European eel for a while, and it's captivated our imagination. It's everything from people used to think they sort of asexually budded because they didn't have any understanding of where are the eels coming from. And every time we took an eel, we could never find any reproductive parts on the eels in fresh water. So therefore, they just must be somehow budding off each other. Obviously, this isn't a recent thought in terms of how they did that, but yeah, we could talk a lot about the eel. And, you know, it's interesting because so many cultures have valued, not just the American eel, but there's a number of different eel species, and a lot of them are important culturally, important economically, and anybody who's been to a seafood restaurant or a sushi restaurant, maybe they've eaten unagi, and so that is a product made from eel, not usually an American eel, but maybe a Japanese eel, more likely. And then in Europe, you know, there was jellied eels was a big diet item for a long time. And so, yeah, very culturally important, very fascinating in terms of reproduction. And, you know, Wes, one of the things I've heard about eels is that hypothesized is that, you know, how did they get such a complex life history? And if we think about it, it's kind of the opposite. We've been talking about, like, salmon is just a good example because a lot of people may be familiar with it. But here, you know, we've got other anadromous fishes, striped bass, some other types of fishes, etc. But the salmon, you know, when the salmon comes in, it'll spawn in fresh water. The eel's the opposite. You know, it's doing the opposite thing. And so I've even heard a hypothesis that we've got a population of eels, the American eel and the European eel, that both go to the Sargasso Sea. And they're not that far apart. But yet one drifts one direction and the other drifts the other. And you mentioned, you know, that this leptocephali stage is fascinating, but that drift of the larvae could be, you know, over a year and a half to get to some places in Europe, or, you know, or 6 months to get some places in the Gulf of Mexico. How did they accomplish that? And where did this all start from? One hypothesis is sort of looking at plate tectonics and basically continental shift, that perhaps, some of this started a long time ago when things were a lot closer together. And as things have branched out over time, things have gotten more and more complicated. Did it happen that way? I don't know. But, for culture of this fish and for populations that eat it, this is an important group of fishes, and we could talk about it for a while because it's so important that a lot of people have tried to culture it, and it's still cultured exclusively on wild capture. So the fish that you eat for unagi at your sushi restaurant are both a product of wild reproduction, but they're also a product of aquaculture, where somebody has put them in a high-density pond and reared them up to grow them out, basically. So that's really kind of a unique group of fishes. And yeah, we could talk a lot. And also, ecologically, one that's not in a good place in terms of population strength.
They collect them at the glacial stage, right? When they're coming into the estuaries, and then they take them to grow out facilities to grow them up.
Yes, and those glass seals are worth a lot of money because, a small amount of glass seals can grow up to be a large amount in terms of body mass of fillets, basically, or of fish for consumption. And because of that, this is a fish species that's been hit hard by impoundments or dams and altering of a lot of the water bodies they're in, plus heavy harvest. And even though it's distributed widely in the U.S., the American eel populations across the board have really gone down. And the same is true of European eel and Japanese eel. And those three species are really some of the hardest hit and utilized by human populations.
Well, Peter, thank you so much. I think we've hit a lot of topics. Thank you so much for coming on today. Really enjoyed talking with you. Your knowledge of fish is pretty incredible.
Thanks for having me, Wes. And I think next time we should start off by some of our adventures.
Thanks, everybody, for listening to Fish University. Please join us again next month. Fish University is hosted by Wes Neal, an employee of Mississippi State University Extension Service and a faculty member in the Department of Wildlife, Fisheries, and Aquaculture. This podcast is part of the Natural Resources University network of podcasts. Funding was provided by the Renewable Resources Extension Act. If you have questions or suggestions, please go to the Extension website at extension.mississippistate.edu. Click on Natural Resources and then select the Fisheries tab in the drop-down menu. Or you can email me at wes.neal@msstate.edu.